Hi everyone, this is Casey. I wanted to share a quick reminder that enrollment is now open for the next cohort of my signature Paradigm Shift program. This is the program where I personally coach you through taking action with the essential skills and mindsets you need to support your PDA child or teen and make true progress. After every cohort, I ask parents for feedback, and what they say over and over again is that the program is life-changing. It empowered them to transform their relationship with their child and stabilize their home. You can use the link in the show notes to learn more, join the program interest list, or dive right in and enroll for immediate access. Now, on to today's show. Hi, and welcome to the At Peace Parents podcast. I'm Casey, and I'm here to empower you in your decision-making as a parent of a demand-avoidant child. My goal is to share insights that will generate aha moments and support your connection with your child. I'm a mom of two amazing little boys, one of whom is PDA, and I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you to teach them how to lead their child out of burnout and find the clarity, peace, and sense of community they need. What does Buddhist psychology have to do with getting you out of burnout as a parent of a PDA child or teen and supporting you in parenting and caregiving for your child? So for me, it turns out it has everything to do with this. And today I want to introduce you to 6 pieces of wisdom that I have learned from Buddhist psychology and explain to you exactly how they apply to the journey with a PDA child or teen, and give you a sense of how to apply it to your own life to get yourself and your child out of burnout while also finding meaning. So before I do, because we're on the internet, I have to do a caveat. So I have never been a religious person, even though I was raised Catholic. Until my son went into burnout, I did not feel a need for spirituality. And in fact, it wasn't something I thought about much except for my yoga practice, which I started during my first experience with panic attacks. And it was much more of a way for me to deal with my anxiety in my 20s and get through the more grueling aspects of my PhD work. So when my son went into burnout, I started exploring spiritual wisdom from all sorts of people, like a Celtic priest, a rabbi, a Quaker, Buddhist thinkers. And it kind of sounds like a joke, like all these people walk into a bar, what happens? But I want to note that because I'm presenting these ideas to hold lightly, not as a new set of dogma or rules or indications that you're doing something wrong as a parent of a PDA child or teen. This is also a little bit crunchy for me because this is something I don't normally talk about more publicly. I usually save it for my coaching work and my work in the Paradigm Shift program because it is pretty personal, but I think it can be really helpful. So here are the 6 pieces of wisdom that I will go through, and they are the following. The idea that there is a divine light within each human being that can never be corrupted. The fact that awareness of thoughts, feelings, and emotions and physical sensations without judgment is the first step to mindfulness. Radical acceptance of the things we cannot control. And then as we're moving into more wisdom and later in our journey with a PDA kid, the next 3 are the concept of a near neighbor enemy, the difference between compassion and fierce compassion, and then finally the idea that the raft is not the shore. Okay, so I'm going to explain each of these to you in a more granular way to see how they apply to your child. Okay, so as I mentioned, I was raised Catholic with the idea that we had to teach children to be good. We needed to explicitly teach them, right? And we had to work at it, and it was the responsibility of the parent, and a lot of it had to do with following rules. Right? And so when my son was going through burnout, my PDA son, it was really hard for me to see the goodness inside of him because none of his actions on the outside were showing any type of compliance, helpfulness, goodness, right? Not only was he avoiding things, he was also growling at me, saying, stop talking, breaking things, screaming. He even did things like I went to the bathroom once and his infant brother, who's now 6, I went to the bathroom just for a second and I came back and he had a pillow over the infant's face. Okay. And if I would look away, he would do things like try and touch his eyeball. And like, I had a really hard time believing he was good. Okay. So when I came across this idea in Buddhist psychology of there's a divine light within each human or sentient being that can never be corrupted no matter what is going on in the surface, it really resonated with me and it gave me the courage to trust that my child was not bad. And I think for many of you, this can be an underlying dichotomy because we have this underpinning of like goodness is defined by actions, right? But really the value and goodness of the child or human is actually inside, and it can be obscured by things like a nervous system response, trauma, etc. So I had some extraordinarily dark thoughts during this time period. And so being able to hold that wisdom of no matter what is happening on the surface, there is an inner light that is there. And my job is to create the conditions, environment, and support so that that inner light can shine, which is very different than I need to teach my child to have the actions that indicate on the surface goodness, like saying please and thank you and putting away their things and doing chores and being helpful, etc. Okay, so when I work with parents in our programming, not all parents have violent PDAers. I would say we have a lot of parents with internalized PDAers who are not violent or oppositional at all. But I've worked with my fair share of families whose children have, locked them in closets, hit them. People have had black eyes. They've had knives pulled on them, etc. Okay. And so in those moments, it is normal for a parent to not be able to trust looking at the data around them that they have a good kid, right? Everyone and everything is pointing to, you have a bad kid, you need to get them under control, there's something deeply wrong with them, etc. And so my job is to hold that anchor of, no, your child is a good child and there's an inner light that can never be corrupted. And my job is to help you get to the point that you can see that. And it may take a very different approach, which is through radical acceptance of how their brain and nervous system works and accommodating so that they don't get to that threshold. And there will be a period of time for which it can be very difficult for parents not to see the goodness of their child. So caveat, because I know the internet well, the interwebs, this belief does not mean that we never set boundaries with our children or others to keep ourselves safe and sane. This does not mean that we let people abuse us or keep adults in our lives that do terrible things. And it also doesn't mean we're responsible for healing or helping every other human on the planet before finding compassion and help for ourselves, because that's actually people-pleasing and high-functioning codependence, okay? So I just needed to say those caveats because we can have that belief, but it doesn't make you have the responsibility for some dysregulated person on the internet or in your real life to be like, oh, they have a divine inner light, and so I need to engage with them. Absolutely not. And we're going to get to that. Okay. So the second thing I want to talk about is awareness without judgment. And I hope this second concept, for those of you earlier in the journey, helps you feel more nourished and held and supported at where you are. Okay. So as I said, when my son was in burnout, he was extraordinarily difficult and scary at times. I was actually scared of my own child. And I had really dark thoughts about it. I thought things like, I want to make this go away. I wish I hadn't had children. I hate my child. Why did this happen to me? I would cut off my finger to make my child not have PDA. I hate being a mom, all the things, okay? So I had trauma, right? Like many of you are going through a traumatic experience. I'm someone who has ruminative thoughts anyways, and these terrible thoughts kept circulating in my head, and I felt really guilty and ashamed, okay? And then when I was going onto the internet and social media to seek support and try and understand what was going on, I also saw all these narratives about like, if you feel grief, then you're grieving a living child, and you're a bad person, you're not neurodiversity affirming, and it just felt like, this binary of I wasn't allowed to feel all these things that were going through my head, okay? So the Buddhist concept of awareness helped me so much. What does this mean? This idea that all the thoughts, physical sensations, and emotions that pass through us are not who we are. They're actually like waves in an ocean, and we are the ocean. So, for example, this can feel like you are a horrible person because you have all these thoughts and you have all these like resentment, and anger, and judgment, and you want it to be different, and you don't want to admit to anyone that that's what's actually going through your head. But I know that it is because I've worked with hundreds of parents just like you, and I have experienced it. But there's a shame associated with it. But when I started meditation, and I would just do it 2 to 3 minutes a day, all the practice was sitting and noticing thoughts that came through my head, physical sensations in my body, and emotions that bubbled up, okay? Without judging them, right? Meaning, oh, negative thought, I can put it on a cloud and it can pass through me. Oh, my stomach grumbled, must be hungry, put it on a cloud, let it pass through me, okay? So what does this practice do on the most micro level? It lets you know that there's a watcher and the things we're watching. So who is watching the thoughts? Who is watching those physical sensations, right? You are not those things. You are whatever's watching and observing those things, okay? And that, we can call it a soul, we can call it a higher self, we can call it a consciousness. So when we start to welcome, without judgment, the human things, the human aspects, the thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations that pass through us, we can also start to have much more compassion for others, because we realize, you see other people and you realize they're also having those negative thoughts and physical sensations and feelings, even if they're not admitting it. Okay. And it also gets us out of this hyper positivity and I always need to be positive, et cetera, et cetera. Why is this important for understanding your PDA child or teen and helping them develop a healthy self-concept and awareness? We don't want to conflate the physical sensations and emotions that come with a very distressing threat response, which is a survival response designed to keep our bodies alive, with who they are, okay? And we want to start modeling and teaching our children, okay, you had this physical sensation of the nervous system, and starting to notice that instead of just having it be who they are and separating it out so that they can understand that they're not their threat response, even if they identify with a neurotype. It's also important in my work with parents who are PDA or neurodivergent themselves. Why? Because they also have a very negative relationship with their threat response that has made them perhaps react or equalize against their own child because of their threat response, or potentially shut down or not be able to access the parenting that they want to access because of the way their brain and nervous system works. The shift starts with awareness. It's the very first step. And so if this is enough for you, that's the practice. Just start noticing as the watcher, watching, oh, that's actually not me. It's part of me, but it's not my higher self, right? There's an inner light that can never be corrupted. And as soon as we can start to create some space of awareness of like, oh, resentment, oh, grief, it's passing through me, this belongs, then we can start to actually shift things. But if we're not even aware of that, then it's really, really difficult to start changing our behavior in that space between stimulus of like, my child is screaming and I'm getting activated, and our response. So creating that space of awareness is what allows us to pause, even if it's just for 2 seconds, and not react in a way that we regret. The third concept of Buddhist psychology that has been extraordinarily helpful to me, to the parents I work with, and is also the core of a lot of my work, because I do believe that this energetically shifts the household and the interaction with the PDA child in a way that goes much deeper than just the tactics of like, we're using declarative language and now we're not talking as much. And yes, those are all important strategies, but beneath them, if the energy is one of trying to control the outcomes and not one of non-attachment, then they're perceiving that as a loss of autonomy. Okay, so let's get into radical acceptance. The very first aspect of this Buddhist psychological wisdom is that life includes suffering. Life includes suffering. Okay, that seems very obvious. But for someone who grew up middle class in the Midwest, in the United States, who worked very hard and did everything right and, followed every single rule and was like the good girl, there is this narrative of if you do everything right, you will be rewarded. If you follow the rules, then nothing bad will ever happen, right? And this sense of that we can game the system of life and do everything according to plan, and then we'll be spared these very real and human aspects of what life is. Okay, so when my son went into crisis and he was in burnout and I felt completely forsaken and isolated and I felt like no one understood me, the thoughts running through my head were, why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? Is this a karmic punishment? Am I being punished for one mistake that I made, right? And when I started to read about and learn and practice more Buddhist mindfulness, I started to learn about this acceptance of like, suffering is a part of life. This belongs as part of my human experience. My son having a disability, it's part of my human experience and it belongs as part of that experience. And that was a very difficult mindset shift for me. I think it's very much associated with maybe all of the West, but particularly in the US society of like achievement oriented. If you're productive enough, like everything is under your control. And so it must be your fault if something terrible happens or something doesn't go your way. So for those of you listening, I'd love for you to just pause and reflect on that. Have you been blaming yourself for your suffering? Have you been racking your brain saying, what did I do to deserve this? Am I being punished for something I did in my 20s? Or, maybe I shouldn't have done hot yoga when I was pregnant, or, I had one glass of wine. And so this is why God or whoever gave my kid PDA. And I think starting to move out of that mindset is so important for our mental health and sanity, and also understanding that there's nothing wrong, right? Like this is part of the human experience, and this is your sliver of the human experience, and there's nothing you did wrong, and there's nothing that your child did wrong, and everything like on a more profound level is actually okay. The second piece of acceptance, which we operationalize in our tools that we use here at Peace Parents to help you move forward with acceptance, is facing this truth that all of us fight against, which is you are either activating your PDA child or you're accommodating them. There is no in between, right? So we don't get to negotiate in the gray space of like, yeah, but if I just found this tool or this expert, or I did it a little bit differently this way, I could like game the system so that even though I'm using a little bit of exposure and behavioral approaches without trust, then, it won't activate them too much, right? Like we all want to go there where it's like, we want to find the gray space of negotiation. But when we start to truly accept, like, you can't change how your kid's brain works. Every time that part of the amygdala and the limbic system, the survival brain, neurocepts or subconsciously perceives that you are trying to control them, that you have an agenda, that you have expectations, that they don't have full autonomy, and that you're putting yourself above them, they will activate. Their nervous system will activate. That's just true. And it sucks. It sucks because it requires us to find a completely different way of stewarding and being the custodians of our children's well-being. The other choice is accommodation, which often looks like bad parenting or is counterintuitive, right? By, your child calls you a name and you have to choose. I'm going to either activate or accommodate them. If you say something back like, you can't talk to me that way, their nervous system will activate again because it's another loss of autonomy, right? We have to make these choices as parents. It doesn't mean that we never set boundaries. But what we do have to recognize is that when we're not accepting that, we're getting stuck and we're not making progress with the child, right? Or the teen. And we also, through cost-benefit decision-making that I teach in Foundations and the Paradigm Shift program, we have to accept our constraints too, right? Like one of the things that I had to go through was like, okay, I have the constraint right now of like, I'm a stay-at-home mom. I don't have any caregiving support. My husband's in a really intensive job and I have 2 kids. Can't change it. Have to find my agency within that. And so when we actually accept what we cannot change, all the things we've been avoiding, grief, rage, resentment, all of it comes to the surface. But it's movement. We're actually accepting the limitations or the constraints so that we can ultimately transcend them, which my family has now done on a certain level, right? Acceptance is like an onion. You're constantly peeling back layers and layers of acceptance, okay? Those first 3 concepts, which are the divine inner light, awareness without judgment, and radical acceptance, were my touchstones for years of getting myself and getting my child out of burnout. So if you're deep in burnout, that might be enough for you. But for those of you who are listening, we're going to explore 3 other sources of wisdom from Buddhist psychology that will help you move beyond information about PDA and navigating that into the energetic shifts and the wisdom that will deepen your peace as you do this. So if you're here with me now and you feel like it, I would love for you to drop in like where you believe you are in your journey. Are you a novice? Are you new here? Or are you a veteran? This next concept in Buddhist psychology and piece of wisdom, I think is extraordinarily profound and one I continually turn back to, not just in my parenting, but also my relationship with my husband, my relationship with my family members, and my relationship with everyone else in my life. Okay, so I'm just going to go through one concept that I think is extraordinarily relevant to the PDA child and the parent of that PDA child. Often when we think of ideals or things that we want to achieve, right? Like unconditional love, that's an ideal that I think transcends whatever parenting style we have, whatever approach we have, no matter where we are on the globe, whatever religion we are, like we all want to reach love with and between us and our children. So the very clear enemy of love that I think most of us will immediately think of is the opposite, which is hate, right? When we think of love, we think of the opposite of hate, and it's like a touchstone of like, okay, how can I be more loving and not hateful? But there's something called a near neighbor enemy, which is also something that undermines love, but is not the opposite of love. And it's proximate, like a neighbor. It looks like love. It can act and dress up like love, but it's not actually love. It's a near neighbor enemy of love. And the near neighbor enemy of love is control. Okay. So when I heard that, my mind like exploded because I was like, yes. So much of my resentment from my child was like, anytime I am trying to influence him, control him, have expectations for him, if I have an agenda on a timeline, an amount of time something's going to work, how he does it, anything, he perceives it and he activates his nervous system and he reacts and avoids it. And I was so angry that this was my life, right? Like, how can you raise a kid if like anytime I have a desire for an outcome, even if it's something positive like reading or meeting friends or going outside and getting some fresh air, it is perceived as threatening and as control. But I started to understand that like my little guy, for whatever reason, was brought into my life to teach me this, to teach me that the opposite of love, yes, is hate, but the near neighbor enemy of love is trying to control another human. And so one of the things that has deepened my, not just spiritual practice, but parenting and relationships is how much can I recognize when I'm trying to subtly control others, including my son, right? Whether it's by praise, whether it's by incentivizing things, whether it's by talking about certain things because I want him to get interested in it and the energy behind that, right? So like if I'm just talking about something like my business, and then he's like, oh, I want to open an Etsy business. And like, it's like this natural offering where it's like, I'm not even intentionally talking about my business so that he learns about entrepreneurship. I'm just talking about my life and his brain neurocepts safety because I'm not trying to make him learn about entrepreneurship, right? But if I were in the room trying to like really get him to notice that I was an entrepreneur, that would be a subtle form of control. And for a PDA, they're going to neurocept that and reject it. So the exploration or the invitation is how deep can you go with trying to control others and their choices and their opinions about you and their emotions in relation to how you're living your life, including your children and spouse. Okay. So when I started thinking about this, I realized how much I try and control others. Okay. Like whether it's, you're in the kitchen and you're like making noises while you're doing the dishes because you sort of passively aggressively want your partner to do the dishes, right? It's a subtle form of control. Or, one of the themes that comes up over and over again in my work with parents in the program and coaching is like, my partner does not believe in PDA. My partner is not on board with this approach, right? And so one of the things we explore is accepting that and not trying to control it. Okay. And that's letting go of control of someone else's timeline, of someone else's opinions, of someone else's way of processing information. And it's very crunchy because like, it feels like your lives are at stake of like, if my partner doesn't get on board with this, how are we going to get my kid out of burnout, right? But especially if you have a neurodivergent spouse or an undiagnosed partner who's PDA themselves, which by the way is very common, the more that you try and control how they come on board to something, the longer it's going to take and the less likely that it's going to happen. And frankly, the more that I've practiced this in my life with people who aren't PDA, the more I see that the more space I open up for them to explore without my judgment, the more traction we can have and real connection. And it's through that connection that people learn and change minds and are open to new information. Okay, so this is work I have to do on myself when I am working with parents live in programming. I cannot control their journey. I can't control their learning. I can't control their pace or their receptivity. And this is why not one piece of my content is here to convince anyone, right? Like, if you don't want to believe in PDA, I'm not going to control that, right? Like, it's totally fine because you're on your own journey, on your own timeline, and you have full autonomy. Okay, so that's the invitation about the near neighbor enemy, which is, again, the opposite of love is hate, but the close concept or ideal that looks like love but actually undermines it is control. And so what we can do in the space behind the letting go of control of others is we can start to focus on controlling ourselves. Okay? The fifth concept that I think is extraordinarily important as you move forward in your journey is understanding the difference between what pop psychology and pop culture and social media calls compassion and fierce compassion, which is a Buddhist concept. Okay, so for many of you, if you're a parent of a PDAer and you're a woman who has been successful in her life, but maybe has a fawn response herself, maybe is a perfectionist or tends towards people-pleasing or high-functioning codependence, which is a term I learned from Terry Cole, who wrote The Boundary Boss. You are going to have a hard time with this one because fierce compassion means telling the truth. And in order to set boundaries, we have to say the truth and recognize and confront the truth to ourselves of what's not working in our lives and who's not bringing in good vibes and energy, and stating our truths about what we will and will not tolerate. Okay, whether that's in real life or social media. And for someone who, like myself, was always hypervigilant and monitoring other people's comfort, emotions, opinions, and reactions above my own, this was a very, very, very difficult one, but I have to be able to do it in order to do this work with you, right? In order to help parents get stuck, I have to be honest about, like, you are always activating or accommodating your child. Like, you cannot change that. We have to find agency within that. And because hopefully we have a level of trust, we're able to weather the trigger that comes from that truth without trauma. But at the same time, like, yeah, compassion doesn't mean never upsetting anyone or yourself or never telling the truth or being, quote, nice to everyone and not setting boundaries. Okay, and that's a concept from Buddhism that I'm going to draw on because I think it gets misconstrued. Okay, finally, and this is one that is a recent exploration for me because we kind of went through the journey of all six, and this is the one that is most recent and I think most advanced. So I'm exploring it here with you too. This is the Buddhist concept of the idea that the raft is not the shore. Okay, what does that mean? So in the Buddhist context, Buddhism is the raft, right? The set of practices, the meditations, the frameworks, the wise thinkers, the Buddha himself, that's the raft, right? It's the scaffolding that takes you across the river of life, of like the suffering and the grief and all the challenges of being human. But if we cling too hard to the raft, instead of getting to the shore, which I perceive as like the principles of unconditional love, peace, radical acceptance, and we use the raft or Buddhism or whatever religion in the name of like harming others or violence or, you know, othering, shaming other people, then we've lost sight of what we're really going for, which is these underlying values, right? So how do we translate this into your life with a PDA child and all of these concepts that you're learning? So for me, the labels, the categories, the tools, the strategies, the scripts, everything that we learn here, whether it's the reels that you're watching, my podcast, or if you take programs with me, we're learning the raft together because the raft is concrete. It's something you can stand on. It's something that will keep you from drowning and it will move you towards the shore, right? But ultimately the shore is what I perceive it as is unconditional love within your family, your child being well, and acceptance of their human expression. And so we have to be careful not to let strategies, tools, labels get in the way of that. And so, when I see the othering that happens in some of the neurodiversity spaces, to me, this is you've lost sight of the shore for the raft. If we cling too tightly to you have to be autistic in order to talk about autism, we're clinging to the raft. That's my perception. And so that's the same is true for what I teach here, right? You're going to take what I teach. You're going to take what I teach. You're going to take the tools and you're going to make them your own raft, right? But there will come a moment, and this is the moment that I'm kind of in, where it's okay, we're near the shore, right? There are things that maybe the PDA lens isn't going to be the wisdom I need, right? Maybe it's more spiritual. Maybe I'm learning about executive functioning because my son's activation has come down enough that we can work through another lens, right? And so we don't want to attach or cling to the raft at the expense of the goal or what we're all trying to do, which is reach this shore of peace and unconditional love and your child being well and accepting of yourself and your human expression. And so that is personally, that sixth concept is what I'm exploring right now within myself and within my family. So I hope that these 6 pieces of wisdom were supportive of you. And I will say that, whenever I'm working with a family and it's there is no solution, because sometimes there's not, the constraints are too high and everything feels impossible. You feel forsaken. This is what I turn to help you and myself navigate that, because it's there isn't a tool to fix it, right? And so how can we be with that suffering? How can we accept that in this moment there isn't a fix, and do so mindfully and with compassion for ourselves to continue on this raft towards the shore? Okay, my friends, I hope that was helpful for all of you. It was great to be here with you live, and I will see you soon. All right, bye. Thanks everyone for being here with me at the At Peace Parents podcast. This is your source for all things related to understanding, supporting, accommodating, and advocating for your PDA child. To go deeper on any of these topics, check out my course offerings and masterclasses at the website www.atpeaceparents.com. To completely transform the way you think about and relate to your child and to bring peace and stability to your home, join us for the next cohort of the Paradigm Shift program.